Hello and welcome to another Cliff Reviews Art House. This time I'm reviewing the film Snow White, directed by Marc Webb. So the reviews I'd read and watched in advance of going to see this film was so terrible that my expectations were really low. I had this recently with the Lion King film Mufasa. I went in with very low expectations and they were met. I really didn't enjoy it. In the case of Snow White, I actually really enjoyed it. Sometimes when you have low expectations of a film, you're perhaps more forgiving of flaws. You watch it with a bottle half full attitude. It wasn't enough for Mufasa, but for Snow White it definitely was. In the case of Snow White, I found it much more magical than I expected. The original Snow White is extraordinary, even though in parts it is problematic in a modern context. I find the new Snow White did have some of the magic of the original. It does have its flaws, I think, but overall, I actually enjoyed it. And it did trigger some of that nostalgic magic from the first film. Although, let's be clear, it's nowhere near in the same league as the first film. The new Snow White has had a really hard time even before it's released. There's been a number of controversies around it and a lot of kind of anti-woke criticism of the film. There's been a lot of criticism of the actress playing Snow White, Rachel Zegler. She has a Colombian American mother, and so there's a criticism that she's not Snow White with skin as white as snow. I personally think this is ridiculous and probably racist. For me, she totally was Snow White. I didn't find any problem there. There's also been some political controversy around the two main actors speaking out on different sides of the Israel-Gaza war. And also, the new Snow White has been criticised for being too woke, for updating the story. Now, there are definitely problems in the original in terms of gender issues and in terms of some of the language around the dwarves. I'll talk more about this in a minute. But I don't object to some modernisation. I think that children that see the new film are also likely to watch the original too. The fact that they've tried to deal with some of the problems in the original provides a fantastic opportunity to discuss with children the difference between the two films. At least this is what I would have done with my children. It is fair to point out that a lot of this criticism exploded before the film was even released, so people hadn't even seen it. After seeing it, on the whole, I didn't feel that the controversies were justified, although I do have some criticisms of the new approach. As I said earlier, I'm not against modernisation of the film to the extent that the earlier one is outdated, even offensive. However, this is such a careful balance, I think. It's great that Snow White has more agency than in the original film. That makes a lot of sense to me. But there is a difficulty here. How far do you go in updating it? If you change it too much, it's not the same. And after all, this is a fairy tale. There's nothing wrong with a strong, independent woman wishing for love in a romantic fantasy fairy tale. Some people might not like the sentimentality, but this is a fantasy, a fairy tale, a love story. My biggest problem with the film was actually the music. They dropped a number of the classic songs. Someday My Prince Will Come, the I'm Wishing One Song duet at the Wishing Well, and also they dropped With a Smile and a Song. These are all classics, and I do feel that they're greatly missed. Clearly there is perhaps tension in these songs between Snow White having agency and taking a leadership role as opposed to taking care of the dwarfs and waiting to be swept off her feet by a prince. But I think there was too big a compromise here. Now, I've only seen the film once and only heard the new songs once, but they just felt like generic musical numbers, completely forgettable. I'm not a fan of musicals, but I am open to being swept away by a musical. My recent review of Wicked is a case in point. I was really surprised how much I loved this film, including the songs. I think that they should have compromised and kept all of the original songs and made the revised story work around them. In the case that they were going to replace some of the songs, the new songs should have been fantastic, and they weren't. For me, this was the biggest disappointment in the film. I liked Zegler as Snow White. I thought she was really good. And the hyper-real CGI dwarfs have come in for a lot of criticism, but I actually thought they worked really well. If you saw them as fantasy animation, they actually worked for me. Since seeing the new Snow White, I watched the original again. It's just so good, if a bit gendered, with some problematic language around the dwarves. But the animation is brilliant, and the songs are great. It's amazing for its time. It was made in 1937, which seems incredible how they produced something that still looks so good today. It was a landmark achievement for Disney, there's no doubt. But it's also important in the history of animation. It was the first feature-length animation, and even the history of cinema as a whole. As is the case in all of these remakes, the original is so much better than the remake. Overall, apart from my comments on the music, I did really enjoy the new Snow White. It made me smile throughout. It was good enough that I felt a nostalgic affection for it. The slating that it's received from the critics is a bit baffling to me. I actually would happily go and watch it again. So overall, I would recommend it if you like a good Disney film. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.